And I will, Jason, could you give me the ability to record as well? I think we're doing the backup on my end.
Sure.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, so let us get started here. As people file in, I will just talk kind of briefly. I know it'll take people a moment to hop into the room, but we're so excited to hold this conversation at, in quotes, the Harvard Graduate School of Design in Cambridge, Massachusetts today. We have some really fantastic speakers to share with you, and we feel really lucky to be able to sort of be in the same room together as the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective, which is a graduate student organization at the GSD. So, Ani Bojo ga Kinawia, Nawakamigo Kwe Indigenous Makwa and Dodem, Kakabikang and Bunchba. My name is Elsa. I'm a second year Master of Architecture student here at the Harvard GSD, and I'm also one of 4 co-founders of the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective, which has been an organization here at the school for about a year now. I'm joined by Heidi Brando and Rogelio Cadena, who can introduce themselves.
Hello, everybody. My name is Rogelio. I'm a first year Masters of Architecture in Urban Design student at the GSD. I'm of Mexican mestizo descent, and I'm honored to be here with all of you.
Yat esh eya Heidi Brando Yanisha, Kanakamawi Nishle do Torchi ni Bashishin, Kanakamawi e Dashichedo, Nashkali Dashinali. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Heidi Brandau and I am Diné and Kanakamawi and a second year Master of Design Studies student at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And before we begin, we want to thank the Harvard University Native American Program for their support in organizing this event. We are so grateful to welcome you to a conversation with 3 generous people whose work we find profoundly inspiring. We invited you all to this conversation focused on housing as one of many possible ways to consider the intersection of design, policy, history, and responsibility to building and living on Indigenous homelands. And before we begin, so to begin, we are joined today by Tamarah Begay. Tamarah is the founder of Indigenous Design Studio and Architecture. Which is a Diné women-owned architectural firm. Ms. Begay is a member of the Navajo Nation and has over 10 years of experience working with Native American tribes on public safety, judicial, education, housing projects, and her recent work for the Navajo Nation has focused on feasibility studies and master planning. As a founding member of the American Indian Council of Architects and Engineers, Tamarah has long committed to mentoring junior Native American office staff and students. Our second panelist is Joseph Kunkel. Joseph is a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation and director of Mass Design Group's Sustainable Native Communities Design Lab, which is based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. As a community designer and educator, his work explores how architecture, planning, and construction can be leveraged to positively impact the built and unbuilt environments within Indian country. In 2019, Joseph was awarded an Obama Foundation Fellowship for his work exploring how to create transformational change through design processes that align with Indigenous values and honor the worldviews of Indigenous populations within North America. Joseph is a fellow of the inaugural class of the Civil Society Fellowship, a partnership of ADL and the Aspen Institute, and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. Our third panelist is Ted Hojola. Dr. Hojola has led a distinguished career as an educator and practitioner in urban and regional planning with particular specialty in Indigenous planning. Since 1980, he has taught at the University of New Mexico. He served as Director of Native American Studies from 1980 to 1996, Acting Director of the Community and Regional Planning Program in 1995 to 96, and Director in 2004 to 2005. He is an ongoing participant in the Indigenous Planning Exchange with the U.S. Department of Education since 2007, and has consulted with the Native American Cultural Center at Northern Arizona State University, the U.S. Department of Justice, the National Congress of American Indians, in addition to many others.
Thank you for those intros. So after we talk with these three wonderful people for approximately 50 minutes, we'll have a short break and then we'll reconvene for a question session. You'll notice in the Zoom webinar, there is a question and answer section, and you can enter any questions that come to mind throughout the event in that box. We'll return to them at the end of this panel. We also have a second panel that will start at 2 p.m. Eastern today with a second set of wonderful panelists, and the same format will apply. So we'll have a talk there and a Q&A with our second group of panelists. So please stay tuned for that. With that, I would like to turn it over first to Tamarah and then to our other panelists in turn to ask you first, sort of how do you approach this question of housing on Indigenous homelands and particularly for Indigenous communities? And is there a project or some work of your own that you'd like to share with us and to sort of elaborate this question?
Sure. Let me. I have a slide real quick. Let me just pull it up. I want to just introduce myself in my native language. Yate Tamarah Begay and Shia Nai Karina and Shia Kiani Bashichin Ashida Shanali Tohogwini Dashache. Just in case there's any of my Diné community members out there. Hello. I have a slide that I want to show. I just need to get permission. Do I have permission to show the slide? Let's see.
Jason should enable that in a couple of seconds.
Okay.
Give that a try now.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, right. Mm-hmm. So your question about the role, what role do you envision for housing in Indigenous communities on Indigenous lands? I think housing needs to really have a bigger role when we're starting to develop our communities, and a larger role, and that really needs to start shaping our communities, because housing can shape our communities in terms of the social aspects. And today you see housing developments, Indigenous communities, and they're more of subdivisions. And I think subdivisions have really ruined our land. They've been really designed more of a linear pattern versus in terms of Indigenous architecture, it's not very organic. So I think it has really put us in a hole. And now that the housing has developed in a more subdivision, and if we think about it in more of a cluster, I think the cluster really works towards our Indigenous landforms. And a lot of this cluster, this linear development has really separated the family unit, and there's really no identity with family within a lot of these Indigenous communities. You see and you hear about violence, you hear domestic violence, and separation of mother and father unit, where our indigenous view is to have a family unit with mom, dad, and an extended family. And as I travel through a lot of Indigenous communities, I remember watching this cartoon when I was growing up, and it was the Smurfs. And I would travel and I was like, wow, I said, this is really a development that I seen in the cartoon, and I call them Smurfville housing. And I really think that we need to really educate people about moving away from this type of development. Early on, for instance, in Europe, when you start looking at some of their developments, and you look at Chaco Canyon, the way that they designed and planned things were really working with the land and working really with the drainage. And that's how they came up with some of these really organic shapes to housing development, and rather just, linear development. And if you think about it, we probably all live in this type of subdivision, right? Linear homes, they look all the same. Very similar to Smurfville, you got the same thing, but maybe the roof type changes in different colors. So I think it's really important that housing really plays a significant role in our communities these days.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really profound observation, that there are very literal and formal questions that we can ask for what housing enables or constrains, both in terms of like what kind of family can actually live together and who is not able to live together, kind of how that is kind of culturally prescribed and determined. And then also further than that, how are our relationships with the things that surround where we live, including like environment. You mentioned drainage as being incredibly crucial for, say, a southwestern environment. It's entirely different from planning and stick building homes in Western Europe. And so I think these are really foundational questions for us to start off with.
Yeah, I agree. And I think with just to add a little bit more with what's going on with this pandemic, people are in their homes and everyone's working from their home. And this idea of the social connector. And I think housing could be a really good social connector between elements in our community, to our schools, to our government, to our cultural facilities. And, we live and we wake up in our homes. And I think we really have to be big advocates to come out and have that idea of housing being, the one type of architecture that really shapes our community in terms of the social aspects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, I will hand it next to Joseph. If you could introduce yourself through the same question, if there's anything you'd like to share about yourself and about your work or a particular project as well.
Sure. Thank you, Elsa, and thank you to all that are on the call today. I'll kind of start with just sharing my screen and posing a question. And I'll just kind of dive right into it. Let me just see if I can get it going. Let me know if it's advancing. But this kind of question the question is not what is the cost of architecture, but what is the cost of not having architecture? And that was kind of from one of our early partners within Mass, is just understanding how can we bring architecture to communities that haven't historically had access to the design professions, architecture, planning, engineering, and so on. And so I kind of pose that question for this discussion and think about ways in which, how do we bring the kind of professions of design, architecture, planning, and engineering to Indian country, and kind of bridging the kind of boundary between native and non-native kind of thinking. Let me just go back here. And so this idea that architecture is not neutral.
I don't know if it's advancing. I don't think it is on my screen.
Okay, yeah, that tends to happen similar to.
Oh wait, we've got a slide there.
There
Okay.
you go. So this here's that first kind of question. And then this idea that architecture is not neutral, either heals or hurts. And I think historically architecture has had a negative impact within these kind of places that we've been working. And so how are we kind of working towards that process of healing? How are we kind of lifting up design as a positive notion? So in reality, kind of how does this all kind of come together? And so our mission is to research, build, and advocate for a design that promotes health, justice, and human dignity. And in many ways, how do we do that within the built environments and in the communities that we're working? And just to kind of frame some of this, some of the conversation around housing, if we're kind of going to use the current funding models that many tribes, all federally recognized tribes, have access to through the Indian Housing Block Grant, the Indian Community Development Block Grant, the Competitive Indian Housing Block Grant, and we were just to solely use those sources of funding, it'd take about 120 years to resolve the housing crisis in Indian country. And so that's just not acceptable. And we have to kind of leverage design, construction, financing all together to really kind of advocate for justice, for a housing process that really lifts up this kind of focus around the housing crisis. Because if we don't, we're going to continue to get housing that doesn't reflect culture, doesn't reflect place, doesn't reflect the communities in which we're kind of living in today. And so it does kind of resonate with this notion of placelessness. And I kind of talk about being kind of thinking about this more holistically, not just in Indian country, but within kind of the US context and the kind of 5 L's of the housing crisis, laws or policies in which kind of we're working within the kind of access to land and thinking about how we are leveraging land and how are we kind of understanding the requirements around land, trust land, fee simple land, both on and off reservation, the ability to kind of access labor in our rural communities. Many of the times kind of accessing skilled laborers, plumbers, electricians, framers. This is really kind of a big piece of how we kind of also see the housing crisis in Indian country, lending, the access to financing, the access to capital debt, mortgages, your kind of traditional ways of kind of accessing home ownership and grants, philanthropy, so on. So this kind of financial conundrum that we find ourselves in. And then the kind of notion around lumber, and lumber in particular has gone up 30, 40, 50% during the pandemic. And more importantly, thinking about materials in general. And so how are these all kind of coming together as it relates to the housing crisis? And just kind of posing this kind of 5 L's as a framing for how can we start to solve in these kind of particular places. And so this kind of question, why are we here? Why are you all here? And listening to this conversation and just kind of sit with that for a moment, but kind of, again, why am I here? It's thinking about the kind of future generation. How are our tribal youth? How are we kind of mentoring our tribal youth to become future leaders in our communities? And I think that's why I'm here and trying to kind of think about how whatever we build, whatever we design, plan is going to inevitably impact this generation. So how can we continue to do them justice and provide a dignified environment in which they can be living in? So thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. I think one of the things that I find really instructive in your work and the way that you discuss questions of design or how to do design work, especially in community, is that there is no way to sort of separate out just one element of this question, even if the problem is really tightly defined, like how do we provide dignified and healthy and enjoyable housing to community. It's there's this constant recursion of discussing policy and understanding land policy and Indian law and their history of how reservation communities and urban communities have emerged in this country and other countries like Canada, and how all of these layers of policy and design expectation, labor access, and how we use and treat materials and the environment that they come from. All of those are sort of interwoven, and being able to address them as opposed to just putting down the problem because it's incredibly complicated is a real strength to that conversation.
Process for sure.
So then finally, I will turn it over to Dr. Ted Hojola and ask you the same question of how you approach the question of housing, the role of housing that you envision for Indigenous communities, and if you have some work that you'd like to share with us.
Okay, Inum po mo pluim My name is Ted Hojola, and I'm from the Pueblo of Isleta. And I am also founder and director of the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute here at the University of New Mexico in the School of Architecture and Planning. So thank you for this opportunity to kind of share our thinking, our methodology, our process, our pedagogy around how it is that you use identity and culture in order to influence both design and planning, especially around community development. So I'd like to go ahead and share my screen if I can. And I'll have to advance these slides manually because I've been having glitches with my technology on my side. But we hosted just actually a few weeks ago a really interesting conversation with Peter Nabokov and Bob Easton, who are the co-authors of the seminal book on Native American architecture. And one of the things that they made as a comment really resonated with me. And that was this notion or this comment about to know the house is to know the person. And I feel that in a way, what's really important in order to sort of think about what is Indian housing for us is to go back and think about how it is that our ancestors had really built a profound connection in the housing that they had developed, because it was so integral to their own meaning and their own worldview and their own experiences in terms of how they progressed through generations and how they advanced through transformational knowledge. So, you know, we can look at a landscape like this in the Four Corners area of the US here in the Southwest, and you see all these amazing layers, which in a way profoundly kind of represent our own notion of emergence from a Pueblo perspective and how we believe we came from the center of the earth and assume different levels of experience and knowledge until we finally came, certainly from the Taiwa perspective, which I come from, to the fifth level, which is now occupying this area that we call land and the earth, the level of earth. And that represents really, in a sense, kind of a thin membrane, if you kind of think about it, with regard to then how it is that we build our relationship with those things that are underground and above ground. And it was essentially sort of given our purpose as clans as we began to look at where we were going to find our own places, our centers of where our worldview and our communities were going to evolve in order to experience this, in order to be able to see and take from what we see to adapt it in terms of the localities where we were eventually going to call our homelands. And you can see this in terms of the archetypes of some of the kinds of earliest building forms of how we believe this kind of ascendancy evolved. So here you see a kiva in the Salinas area here in New Mexico. But what I love about this is you can see all the different levels that probably were also metaphorical and symbolic in terms of that kind of ascendancy. And then ultimately it transformed into a specific kind of proto form, which we called a pit house, which was the earliest evolutions of our housing types. And essentially, as they became more specialized, then these forms, which were separated between domestic and spiritual uses, began to separate and become functionalized in terms of what we know as kiva today, but also house as the other. And in that process of transformation, then you can see that there was a specific thing in terms of how it is that they built that relationship to the environment. They certainly didn't enter it in terms of brutalizing it. They instead conformed to it in this amazing kind of way of building a synergistic relationship in the sense of how it is that rather than cutting into the earth, the form itself dictated how it is that these forms evolved, and in particular then how it is that our own society began to reflect that profound kind of relationship and worldview understanding. And of course, as the other presenters have already said, the biggest impact that was weighed in terms of contemporary issues today is the imposition of US federal HUD housing, which essentially is an imposition based on Euro-Western values, real estate, looking at single unit family, building these kinds of units that are totally dependent on materials from the outside that are essentially alien, and also introduced a false sense of property rights to people, and essentially segmented us into these kinds of developments that no longer represent that kind of collective sense of what it is that our communities themselves were sustained of, and how it is that we represented ourselves within the worldview. You know, there have been some attempts in order to try and replicate the sort of feeling of a Pueblo house in this particular case. This is a modern Pueblo house. It's got stucco, but there's nothing that really is represented in terms of the materiality of the original adobe turone kind of constructions, or the vigas, or anything of this. It's basically a balloon frame wooden structure, and in a sense, it's kind of a way to appease the tradition of the community. But the big question is, does it really function in the way that a traditional house would? And I think this essentially bears a testament to the fact that it doesn't. So you see a HUD house represented on the right-hand side with a pitch roof and all the modern amenities. And that's not to detract from the reality that our people love the amenities that these types of houses bring in. But in terms of how they actually function traditionally, in terms of ceremony, in terms of function, in terms of seasonality, they don't replace it. And in some cases, or in many cases, in many of our pueblos, you see these two places represented side by side, with a traditional house on the left, when that purposefulness is necessary, and then that's occupied and used. And then on the right-hand side, the daily sort of humdrum kind of living lifestyle, because many of us have now become wage economy and no longer really self-reliant, self-sufficient in terms of our agricultural existence, which was our livelihood. That I think that juxtaposition of what it is that you see here really, in a sense, represents the kind of dilemma that we're confronted with right at this particular place and time. So we still do have examples of some of the original archetypes in terms of this. Of course, Taos Pueblo is famous because it's a World Heritage Center. This still is a living community, but metaphorically speaking, there's many elements of this that attend to those original slides that I showed, dealing with how it is that this worldview really is also represented by the levels of the buildings that you see. There's 5 levels. It also pays significance or homage to the landscape that's in the back, where the Blue Lake in this particular case, which represents the emergence place, also exists. So all of these kinds of things are really attendant to being able to not just simply deal with the function of a place, but in a sense then support the kind of relationships and the complexities of our people in time and place. So that's essentially what I'd like to share in terms of thinking about how it is that we rebuild that connection to the past and make it both necessary, strategic, and vital to how it is that we continue to think about our visioning in the future.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for those slides, especially. I think they're incredibly helpful in illustrating the deep context that you're talking about, and how incredibly specific some of these building technologies and traditions around their use are to place and to a lifestyle, and then how the incongruence of something like HUD housing, as well as the pattern of life that it assumes for changing economies and changing patterns of work and labor, which is kind of similar to what Joseph was saying, is just incredibly helpful to understanding this like arc of how Indigenous designers and planners are coming to bear with their skills from these disciplines in building, and how they ask these questions of, where do we interject in these systems, and how do we take lessons both from say the professions and sort of the way the building works at an economic scale right now, with knowing that there are these like much longer legacies and lessons for how to build efficiently and in a really sustainable manner within community, which looks extremely different in most cases. So I think that's really helpful. Thank you. Let's talk to everyone. I don't know if there's one necessary question to start with, but I would say I'm curious seeing one another's presentations and kind of laying some similar questions on the table, all of you. Sort of where do you locate some optimism, or where do you see some of these things start to overlap in productive ways in terms of crafting housing for Native communities?
I guess I could start. I think with Joseph and Ted, there is a lot of similarities between our presentations, and one of the things is really going back and studying a lot of our indigenous structures. And I'm a big advocate, and I know Joseph and Ted are big advocates too, with learning from our past and learning from the past. I mean, it could just be, looking at how, brick was laid, and some of our indigenous structures are still standing today. But when you go into architectural education, more of this Western education, you learn more of this modern way of, cinder block housing, how to put this together. And a lot of our indigenous structures are really great examples in terms of constructability, sustainability, and connecting the culture and the language and the traditions all together. And I think that, having this talk, with Ted and Joseph, we need to continue to have this conversation. And it's going to take many years, as Joseph's slide said. It's not going to happen within 5 and 10 years. And I think it's slowly getting people's interest of how housing in indigenous lands need to be manipulated so that there is a better type of housing prototype, and not just taking the literal interpretation of the indigenous architecture, but taking things that we've learned. And myself here at IDSA, when we work with different communities, we come up with planning principles, and we use that as a conversation, rather taking a literal interpretation of the indigenous architecture. And I think diving into it a little bit more about, where we've come from, the importance of the hearth, and how that connects us socially is important in a connection to Mother Earth and Father Sky. And you don't really see that in a lot of our housing today.
I think there have also been attempts in order to try and reform the approach to housing. I know in 1996, NAHASDA, which is the Native American Sustainability and, no, I can never remember what it is. Native American, hang on a second, I'll Google the damn thing.
That's a long acronym.
Assistance and Self-Determination Act. NAHASDA, that's why everybody calls it NAHASDA. Was enabled in order to empower more local control over the kind of housing types that they could evolve, all the way from even allowing home ownership associations to occur, to having more individuals participate in how it is that this kind of housing could actually be constructed more attuned to their own kind of family and community needs. But quite honestly, it's been a failure by and large. And it's not because that the policy wasn't written correctly, but it's because people themselves, in a way, have not really challenged and taken the prerogative in order to actually apply themselves and bring in the expertise that they need in order to really begin to take charge of what is going on with the way that the housing itself is developed. And some of the things that we still do not see, even though these houses still are coming in waves, as buildings lead standard housing, building sustainable standard housing, bringing in more retrofits in there. you know, being able to make these houses much more cost effective and cost efficient. None of these things seem to be done. Instead, they seem to be more formalitic in terms of looking at how it is that building standards are actually driven more by government requirements, or as driven by the Bureau of Indian Affairs or by Indian Health or whomever. But, you know, there's very little creativity and actual attention to having people themselves actually build what it is that they want.
And I would say, I mean, to add, I would kind of answering your initial question, Elsa, I remain incredibly hopeful and optimistic about the work that we can do in Indian country. I would say that how do we leverage, I mean, building on Ted's point around Nahasda and understanding the policies that were put into play, I think there's a lot of flexibility within those policies, although like Ted has said, I don't think we've taken advantage or leveraged them to the fullest extent. I think we tend to, as tribal housing authorities and tribal housing programs tend to have to abide by perceived rules that the Department of Housing and Urban Development puts on tribal housing programs and requirements around how to use federal dollars. I think in many ways, if we were to push back and advocate for ways to creatively leverage those funds, we could really leverage the kind of self-determination in that policy. And so I think we need more people, designers, architects, planners that understand the policies and understand how to flex those abilities within those policies to do what we kind of deem culturally relevant or kind of culturally focused specifics. And I think at that point, will we be able to use the dollars in ways that we think are appropriate within the communities that we're working in.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that there's some thread of what all of you are saying, which is that especially for Indigenous designers, of whom there are not that many on this continent, there is sort of a building of savviness. You sort of construct yourself as this like scholar, both within the institutions and like the disciplinary knowledge of architecture, planning as it's educated in schools right now. If you're especially lucky, or if you're younger, like many of us, there are also schools and programs and different kinds of coalitions that are trying to build that knowledge in a more internal way. Not all of us attend one of those schools. I certainly don't. But then there's also the sort of the knowledge that comes from moving in both the professional and in perhaps like more traditional like ways of visiting one another and conducting these conversations among communities, and needing a level of knowledge or familiarity with both one's own traditions and context and environment, a sense of a history that's not taught in architecture school, and then an ability to kind of move among Indigenous nations and different kinds of communities and to have similar conversations without your own expertise on these places, but with an ability to conduct that sense of, you know, I can give you a sense of what the federal government is expecting here and what's kind of been done. I can give you a sense of what my nation might talk about, but then I can also help you have the conversation within your own nation. What did housing look like before? What do you want community to look like? How does it need to function so that your whole family has this sense of belonging and participation and determination for themselves? And I find that really, you know, it's really challenging to have this many levels of expertise, but it does seem like kind of what's called for. And so I guess the question that I turn back to the panel is, what do some of those conversations look like, or what are some of the really fulfilling conversations that you've had around projects or around even crafting the like accompaniment or support for creating projects and creating building and community? What do some of those conversations look like, and kind of what surprised you about like being able to be in community or being able to bridge between the like technical knowledge or different disciplines and community needs or traditional needs?
Well, one major example that I think gives us a lot of hope and potential has occurred in Okeo-Wingay, formerly known as San Juan Pueblo here in New Mexico, where there's been a concerted effort now for maybe the last 15, 20 years in order to actually repatriate people back into the heart place, into the plaza area of the traditional village. And they went forth very systematically to, first off, take away the logjam of why a lot of these places were not being occupied as a result of issues around land tenure, negotiating that, but also setting up contracts with new families to move in there who had children in order to provide these kind of longer term relationships with the place itself. Because what essentially had evolved over time is, as a result of housing, everybody moved to the periphery of the village, and the village itself just became a ceremonial center. And because it wasn't occupied most of the year, then a lot of the structures themselves began to decline and deteriorate. And the community basically had a conversation and said, if we don't do something to reverse this, the life, the heart of our community is no longer going to be there. So they've systematically gone in and completely remodeled and actually retrofitted all of these houses to modern standards, but using and keeping intact all the kind of traditional ways of the integrity of the materials and the symbolism and the values that are around that. And they've become an incredible successful model of how to actually revitalize a place. And other pueblos are now sort of taking heed and also considering that as well too.
I would add, I mean, what we're seeing and that particular project at Okeo-Wingay, the notion that we deserve this, like we deserve to live within the heart of our own community, I think is important to lift up. And that design played a pivotal role in that process. When I was working for the Santo Domingo Tribal Housing Authority, this notion that we deserve good design and that they kind of see the potential around a design process as being beneficial and not just an added extra, right? And so I think prior to NAHASDA being passed and post NAHASDA being passed, this idea that we get to drive a process, I think is important to lift up, that architecture is part of the development process and not just added extra, that it's not just an additional cost to the development process. And so that idea that architects are important to a development process, that indigenous thinking, indigenous knowledge, indigenous architecture is important to a process is like the aha moment in many of the projects that I think we've worked on, that, oh, you are pivotal as an indigenous thinker, indigenous designer, architect, planner, like that's important to our future development. And I think when we get to that point in the conversation that they see the benefit and see the importance to that, I think that is where the light bulb goes off. And I think we're doing the work justice.
Yeah, I guess I'll add, we focus a lot of our work mainly on Navajo, but we've worked with other housing entities, across the nation. And I think your question that you ask is quite complex. And I think there's all these things that need to be tied together. And I think that there's no really one solution. And I think with Ted and Joseph's conversation, yeah, there's not one solution. And this conversation that we're having is good because housing is expensive when you build on land. And I think people tie architecture, well, if you have, and this is the Western view, right? If you have a well-known architect that designs your home, like your social status is really high. And I think the architecture and the designs and the planning that we're talking about is more on a community and social aspect side, that, architecture is for all. It's just not for people that have high status. And we have to, again, continue to educate, to our community members that architecture is for all, it's for everyone. And I think when we make those changes, people are going to be more in tune to speak up about their housing type, and say, hey, I'm going to stand up for my voice. I'm going to have my sovereign right to tell you that I want something that's different. And I want something that is, going to be grown from our community, that seed and that connection to, you know, the culture, the language, as well as the traditions. And, you know, solving that issue, you know, with the cost of construction, I mean, that's another big conversation. We see constructing in native land is about 30 to 40% higher than urban areas. And that's significantly high. And, you know, having that conversation with Nahasda and HUD is important because there's a set budget. And, you know, when you're trying to value engineer or reduce your costs, a lot of it has to do with, you know, sustainability. We're reducing the R values of our installation. Utilities is expensive on native land, on indigenous lands. And, you know, what do we do? I mean, it's a big conversation that we need to have.
Yeah, thank you, Tamarah, and thank you, Ted and Joseph, as well. I think these are all really coherent responses to an incredibly complicated question that I threw at you. So thank you for engaging with it at that level. I think that the complexity of the answers are completely spot on, and yet there is sort of a common thread of optimism in, like Joseph said, the aha moment of an architect's role in actually fulfilling the coordination of design and the kinds of creativity that Tamarah is locating in community, when the resource and the ability to observe how some of these things take place on the ground is really helpful. And to what Ted said about repair and the role of kind of understanding the structures that we inherit, and especially those that are crafted maybe not with the logics that we're trying to resist in terms of development or value engineering. And perhaps these as well as like a really wonderful question of how you are able to adapt structures or re-inhabit structures that have served these functions really well, and make sure that they're accessible to families and growing families in the community. And that this in itself, like that kind of inhabitation, if you can get there with the building, really does have a big impact on the life of community and also the lessons that we take from that kind of building into what we build next. So I think these are really helpful lessons for us to put out there. I realize this is going by really fast. And so I want to kind of bring us to two questions that the HIDC especially wanted to ask. And then we'll take a short break after that and we'll have a Q&A with the audience. They're accumulating. We have some really good questions. So we'll come to those after a short break. But one question that I want to put to you now is kind of what are some of the roles that you have seen that you think are really productive, or what do you want to see from those who participate in design and building in Native communities who are not from Native communities themselves, and kind of what are some of kind of the productive roles and responsibilities that you'd like to see from the non-Native design community as people become more interested in the kind of work that you're doing and the kind of work that communities are doing, and kind of what are the important things that you see to keep in mind there in terms of that participation?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as non-Native community, in as much as, in my mind, what's really driving a lot of the issues around providing Native housing is infrastructure development. I mean, Tamarah kind of touched on that in the sense that it's just so costly to be able to do a development because they're in isolated places. You're bringing infrastructure away from a long ways, and you're trying to build some sort of cost-effective method for bringing in water and sewer and electricity and highways, and I mean that's all balled up and trying to even solve before you put any kind of footprint for the kind of house that you want to put there. So I think it has to be developed from the standpoint of us as Native people becoming smarter about how we become more self-reliant and self-sufficient, bringing in new kinds of ways to build this kind of infrastructure so that we have a lot more latitude for people to actually take over and build their houses the way that they want to. And particularly not from the standpoint of a turnkey type of situation, but more from the organic model that we used to have, which is that When a family is small, they start with a few rooms. When a family is large, then they build on and expand, and the house grows itself organically. These hot houses that are there are driven by real estate marketing. 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, and there's supposed to be mobility so that when a family grows, then you're supposed to take over a bigger house. Well, I can tell you that's not part of the inheritance and land tenure system that people are used to. When they get a house, that's it. That's their lifelong obligation that they pass on to their children. And they certainly are not going to have anybody come in there and dispossess them, even as much money as they could bring to the table, like you would find in mainstream society.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, building on that kind of idea that historically, like quote unquote HUD housing, while it might be developed by a tribal housing authority or tribal housing program, is I wouldn't say all developed off of a this kind of Western notion of a real estate model, but most are, right? So this idea that, but it's based off a real estate model that is not actually there in Indian country, right? Indian country doesn't have a real estate market per se, right? You can't buy and sell homes like you can on fee simple land, which I think is important to lift up. And to copy paste that onto reservation land or trust land is a kind of, it just doesn't work at this point in time. And so if we're thinking about the kind of non-native context or ways in which how do natives and non-natives work together to kind of progress tribal housing on sovereign land or tribal trust land, I think it's how are we working collaboratively? How are we working with the financial systems like the kind of big banks that don't lend on tribal trust land to create home ownership and to really create a housing market that could potentially flourish? How are we thinking creatively about tribal trusts, right? Can we create equity on tribal trust land that is held by kind of indigenous entities and tribal businesses? Like that is a way of flexing tribal sovereignty, I think, in an incredibly powerful way. You look at who's doing most of the design work, architecture work, construction work on tribal lands. They are typically non-natives because there are not a lot of native designers, construction people, so on. So how are we building those skill sets from an indigenous perspective? And I think from a non-native perspective, there's an obligation for non-natives to be supporting these systems, like and within the academy, within university, and within the kind of unskilled and skilled labor professions. And so there's a lot of work there. It is kind of hyper complex, but when you start to break it down into its nuances, I think we can find solutions embedded in there.
Yeah. For me, another great question that you wanted us to answer. I think reaching out, and I think that this idea that Ted and Joseph also talks about is this participation, collaboration, and a lot of indigenous designers use that collaboration when we design, but it needs to extend out further, and maybe putting that connection with architect, designer, planner with the housing entity, and the housing entity with NAHASDA and HUD. And I'm sure that's probably happened, to some extent, but, having that dialogue, because we've got that experience where when we're building, there's a lot of factors that, in schooling and architecture as a designer, a designer, architect, and planner, we have to think about this holistic approach, including the stories, about how we want to design and plan, the social aspects of it as well, and trying to connect the culture and the language and traditions. But then, you are designing a home, and you have to abide by all these requirements. Like your home can only be 1,200 square feet for a 2-bedroom home. And indigenously, we never really lived in separate rooms. And you've got this wall, and what is that wall causing, right? It's causing a lot of ills with your housing. Like, what about having more of an open space? And a lot of our design standards don't really, are open to that. So we have to design things that, are very unique. But if we can have that collaboration, with the housing entity as well as with, the funding agencies, that's really important. And it may have that may have happened in the past, but I think we need to continue to just be open about it and have that conversation, because I think things can change. And I agree that it's not just non-natives, using that word. It's just everybody has to be, open about having that conversation of, okay, well, what does it take to build on Navajo? As a designer, you're thinking about, well, you're designing in a floodplain, right? And you got to connect sewer. There maybe be a lagoon somewhere, and that lagoon is over capacity. Maybe they need more liners to that lagoon. And maybe the single phase needs to be brought 5 miles, to that housing component. There's no road, there's no paved roads. We started a project out in Arizona when we had a project for a senior center, and it was through NAHASDA funds. There was no paved road, and it took us like an hour from the paved road to the dirt road to get there. And the thinking about that was like, wow, it's going to take a little bit more time. When it rains, it's going to be muddy. So it's really this kind of dynamic thinking, collaboration, and participation by everybody.
Thank you for that. I think there's one more set of thoughts, and I think we started to get to them with these ideas that you're putting forward for us, which is that we're curious what you want to see for the next generation. We're curious what you want to see coming from schools of design and from other paths to design besides standard architectural education. And also within that vision for what you're kind of hoping is coming next from young people who are making choices for their education or their mentorship right now. What do you think needs to happen within these schools and beyond these schools in order to kind of support that vision for the future?
So I want to see our future generations build their own houses. And, the house that I'm in was built by my dad, and I added on to it. There's no federal funding that came into it. We did it the way that we did with traditional materials. We harvested the turones from the river, brought the vigas from the mountains, did it all the traditional way. It's over 50 years old, adding on in this kind of organic way. And really, when you do that, then you know every nuance of your house, and you have many kinds of stories and meaning that's behind it. And I think, if we can ever get back to that level, then people would become smart and become more selective about what it is and why it is that they're doing what they're doing. And I think the travesty that exists right at this day is that if you look at the disassociation in terms of the housing market here in New Mexico, and you look at a place like Santa Fe, which has a high standard of living, those non-native people that have come in have basically appropriated our Adobe traditions and use it as their high standard mark. And yet you find none of that in our Pueblo communities, even though that's our birthright. So what the hell's wrong with, that kind of situation? How do we end up getting ourselves in that way so that something that was our birthright now has been given lock, stock, and barrel and given as high amenity to people who, can afford that, but, have created this kind of disparity of what used to exist in terms of our own self-reliance and self-sufficiency. We need to take that back. It's just as simple as that.
Yeah,
go ahead, Tamarah.
Okay, yeah, I'll just add to that. And I think you also talked about what should some of the schools do. I think schools should start implementing more history in in their books about Indigenous architecture and about Indigenous planning, and get more people reading about it, wanting to do additional research on these types of Indigenous structures, because we can all learn from it. They still exist today. prime example, Chaco Canyon. Structure still exists, and they use a lot of local materials. The idea about design, art and architecture is all very fluid, in that architecture. And I think other thing is, we need to also grow our own. We need to also grow our own architects, designers, and planners within our community. They understand the culture, and we want them to be advocates, for themselves and their community. And a lot of these younger upcoming designers, planners, and architects, I see that enthusiasm in them. And they are going to stand up, and they're going to, voice their opinion and make some changes. I think that's really important, for our younger generation. And then also just working with technology. Right now, with the pandemic, everyone's, doing Zoom meetings, go-to meetings. And with technology, we can do a lot. And incorporating that and thinking about, how can we work with technology, as our communities grow.
Yeah, and I guess I would add, what do we want to see in this? And I'll preface this with, you don't know what you don't know, right? And when I started my kind of undergraduate engineering education and architectural education on the East Coast, my graduate education, I didn't have an entity like the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute. I didn't have any Indigenous professors or mentors going through schooling. And while I wouldn't give my education back where the courses, the course load, the kind of design processes that I learned during my design education, I would definitely, if I were to be teaching it much more differently. Like, what is that kind of Indigenous lens through a design education that academia can kind of offer, right? I would like that ability to kind of understand those instances and those ways of thinking. I had to kind of develop when I kind of started practicing, and that was just like if I could have had any kind of classes that are offered right now at UNM as a undergraduate or graduate, I think that would have changed how I would maybe have approached practice, and that had to be kind of learned internally. And now it's like found this place here in the Southwest, and there's so much to learn from. Like being able to kind of go back and forth between these two kind of spaces is pretty powerful. And so how do we change kind of the academy in ways that lift up Indigenous knowledges, I think is really, really important. And I think across the board that design schools have to be doing that, and doing it in a way that adjusts regionally, that adjusts nationally, and so on. But yeah.
Thank you for these thoughts. I think these are all really wonderful ideas in terms of kind of the stakes for design education and also for self-education and the kinds of things that we want to see built in the next generation and then be passed on from there. So I think these are all really, really good things for us to consider. We're going to take a short break. Please feel free to mute yourself, turn off your camera, get some water, whatever you need to do, and we'll try to come back in about 5 minutes. And then we'll do a Q&A with our audience questions, which we have several, and we'll end from there. So thanks so much. See you in just a couple. And we have some really wonderful questions to share with you from the audience. Right.
So Elsa, can I share something first for tomorrow before we begin?
For sure.
So she was talking about Smurfville. I wanted to show her the inhabitants of Smurfville. So let's see. And then here's the little warrior guy, Smurfed here.
Smurfville, yeah.
Yeah, so they inhabit. And then finally, you can't end with little Indian princess here.
Oh,
But just so you know that real Indians inhabit Smurfville. So
yeah.
See, this is the strength of living in the same house for 50 years because I can't collect things like this. I don't have anything to show.
Well, those were from friends in Germany. So, hey, you know, Germans love Indians.
Okay, good. So we have almost 30 questions in the chat, and so while Rogelio moderates a few that we've pulled out that we think we would most like to hear from you or that touch on kind of more than one of these questions at once, I will also go through the chat and respond to some others that we may not get to in time. So with that, Rogelio, could you take us into some of these questions?
Sure, yeah, and thank everybody for the questions. I'll start off with Patricia Johnson Castle. So she says, hi folks, Nakumek for this opportunity. Joseph, thank you for explicitly flagging the issue of cost. The buildings in our region that have been explicitly culturally based in architecture have all been extremely expensive. To a point, I think people in our region are beginning to resent architecture. Any insights from members of the panel on how to communicate with the public on the value of culturally based architecture and or how to communicate about the use of architecture to heal?
Yeah, it's a it's a complex question, a hard question to ask. I mean, and especially when you're kind of working in a community that there's dire need in housing, right? Just the basic notion of shelter is what is needed. And I would say that being able to communicate and work with community members to understand how architecture, how design, how construction kind of contribute to the idea of home and the idea and the notion of what home could potentially mean. I think it's really kind of diving into that conversation in a deep way that allows broader community members to understand like the potential around not just housing, but the definition of home. That took a long time. For instance, that took a long time. It took almost a year to a year and a half to have that discussion with community members within Santo Domingo or Elsa Pueblo, like that. And we continue to have those conversations with communities that we work with in the Plains, in the Pacific Northwest. How do we kind of wrestle with this idea? And now with construction costs skyrocketing, how do we have those conversations? And I'd say that when we think about a housing development that is particular to place, that is particular to a site, initial upfront costs are going to be expensive. But if we can kind of understand the kind of scales of economy and understand ways to kind of broaden the potential of not just a one-off home, but how can multiple homes start to achieve a larger mission, like that's where I think we can find value in the architectural process. But it's a long conversation and it's a nuanced conversation that I think you need to find a design team that can support that type of effort.
Part of, I think also that responses around where does the economy get recirculated? Because right now, a lot of these kinds of developments that are occurring are benefiting everybody from the outside, and very little of that is actually being retained within the community itself as far as, you know, wages and materials and things of that sort. So I would think that tribes themselves, in terms of being able not just to build bureaucracies like housing authorities, but their own construction firms, and being able to employ a lot of Native people who are actually skilled in many kinds of diverse crafts, bring them into this kind of housing mix, and just use that as a way to sort of recirculate all of that economy back and keep it within the community is another strategy.
Yeah, can I share a slide? Because I like that question about how can architecture also heal? And if I could just show a slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about it, and because I want people to be excited about architecture. And if they had a bad experience, I think, like Joseph indicated, like you're gonna have to find the right person to do it. Architecture can really shape our thinking. And you can do this if this is specifically for Navajo, but you can do this for any other indigenous tribe, is really thinking about your architectural indigenous structure and really learn about that space and implement this into your community's design process and thinking, and talk about what's the importance of like an east entry. We know that on Navajo, the Hogans, the entrance faces east, but there's more things to face in the east. It's really about greeting the sun. It's about morning birth and beginnings, and you move into this clockwise motion, and thinking about how you enter that into your community or into your space. And as you move to the south, it talks about work, play, and industry. And as you move to the west, it's about this community gathering, social and family. And also moving towards the north, what talks about rest, rejuvenation, elders, wisdom, and strength. So you take those pieces and you try to apply it into your architecture, because architecture, really shapes our thinking. And it shapes our space. And I spoke about this idea of social, looking at the social well-being wheel. We've been taught for many years, and if you think about this, when you were brought up, when you were small, your parents probably said to you that, hey, don't, you got to be tough. Don't cry. Don't show that that you're crying. Don't show that you're hurt. And if you think about it, like if you were ever down or, you weren't feeling right and, you just wanted to express yourself and you maybe cry, and it's okay to cry, right? You feel a lot better. And I think architecture needs to think about those social spaces of, connecting and walking. When you walk, when you're outside, the connection to nature, that's going to also make you feel better. Having these spaces throughout your building, your community are important. And architecture can definitely heal. You have the idea of light, natural light, makes people feel a lot better. So again, finding someone that can, design a space that you want is really important. But I don't want people to think that architecture and design is just four walls. There's I've always get people that tell me, oh, well, you're an architect, can you draw me my home? And I just need this. I need 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and 1 car, 2-car garage. So I explained to them about, there's more to it than just drawing. And I think, again, expressing that and educating people about, architecture can definitely heal.
Great. So I guess to the next question, it's coming from Pateri Light. From Ted's intro presentation, in those 2 houses, how are the loves different in feel and kind? I think he's referring to the 2 homes on the same area. As a houseless person, I find it really important to participate in the building of my home. How else could I stay in it and know how to care for it? Also, I realized when giving the choice to build my own home, I found out that my neighbors are really important too. I left Standing Rock for inspiration. That was really illuminating about how communities can support each other. Waiting for approval for housing to be built is a big limitation. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think at the heart of the issue is the fact that, as a Western kind of oriented society now, we're kind of used to this notion that things get done in a day, that, you have a house or you don't have a house. But, when you look at the kind of processes that occurred within our traditional housing, these things occur over a lifetime. A house is never complete. And even when looking at it from the standpoint of how it is that the traditional materials that are used in order to put together an adobe or terone house here in the Southwest, it takes a year just to be able to cut the terones from the earth and then to cure them, to harvest the vigas from the mountains, bring them down, cure them, and get them ready. So just in terms of that preparation process, that's a year's time. And in order to be able to do it effectively, you can't do it by yourself. You have to deal with it in terms of a collective, either your friends or your extended family or your neighbors or whatever the case is. So it becomes a whole group process. And I think, you know, that's the kind of connection that is really behind the value of trying to stage something like this and consigning yourself to the fact that it's not going to happen overnight, but when it does finally evolve, that it has a history, it has a meaning, it has a relationship, it has an attachment to your own self in terms of your own life, and that it will continue to evolve and grow that way for the rest of your life. And hopefully then you'll have others in order to inherit and carry on that as well too. So it's a total mind thing, you know, besides just thinking about design of a house and getting it done. And I guess, you know, the kind of thing that I just want to say is it's going to take time. And that's why we think in terms of generations when we're looking at how it is that we evolve these kinds of patterns. And because it happens over these generations, then that's how the worldview itself begins to emerge, and housing then becomes integral towards the representation of that worldview, exactly the way that Tamarah presented it. That's a whole life cycle there that she's representing.
I would add to that, like in kind of contemporary society, this notion of building a home has become a monetized process, right? I'm going to hire an electrician, I'm going to hire a plumber, I'm going to hire a framer, I'm going to hire a heating and ventilation person to do my work, and it becomes an exchange. I give that person money for an exchange of services, and we're going through this right now. I'm kind of very fortunate to kind of bought a house, and the ability to kind of develop the relationship with those individuals, I think, is important. Like you want that person invested in your home just as much as you're invested in that home. And so how do you kind of build that kind of relationship with those people providing those services, that it's not just an exchange of money, because you're going to be living here and you want that person's work to be just as kind of lifted up in a similar way. And I think when we're looking for contractors to work with on a project, I think finding those individuals that you want to work with that kind of provide those nuances and that attention to detail is incredibly important. And of course, this is kind of like talking and coming from a place of privilege, right? Being able to kind of find that contractor that can invest time and so on and so forth. But I think that's the way, in an ideal place, we could maybe hopefully find ourselves in.
So one thing that I might interject, and it might drive Tamarah a little crazy because, you know, she's much more, I think, used to the kind of professionalisms that you have to do in terms of being able to make sure that you've got liability in the projects that you do. My dad came out of the Indian boarding school, and he learned all the trades as a result of his education. So when he started on the house here, everything that he did was his training, electrical and plumbing and so on and so forth. And, you know, I have hard lessons to this day in terms of trying to figure out exactly how he put things together, but he did also apprentice me in these kinds of things. So I was able to carry that on. But the other reality is that, you know, we've got situations in Indian country here where, you know, people who don't have that same knowledge and resourcefulness trying to do things for themselves end up burning their house down, creating all these kinds of situations. And, you know, by and large, we don't have many tribes that have licensed workers that, you know, come in and troubleshoot these kinds of things. And I think, you know, that kind of presents a particular challenge for people who are trying to do things for themselves. Where do they go and get these kinds of things?
Ted, that does kind of drive me a little crazy, because I do have a photo, and it kind of scared the living daylights out of me and they had it was a family member out on Navajo trying to construct a traditional hogan. And they emailed me because they were having issues in terms of the structural component. And if I could share you this, and I'm like, yeah, like Ted hit the hammer on the nail for sure. And let's see if I could share my screen here. Let's see. So if you guys see the screen, but there's a family member that was designing and constructing their own traditional Navajo hogan, and they ended up getting some structural issues with it. And if you see at the entrance of the hogan, you've got these posts. Once they started adding on the roof, this vertical element started moving away. And they said, if we add any, I told them if you add any more weight to it, that thing's it's gonna fall off, and you guys need to be really careful of it. So they had it connected to that vertical purse at the entry, but there was also no connection onto the top. So in structures, we do think we learn about moment diagrams. So I explained it to them. I said, this is exactly why, you're using some modern material that, you're trying to use some existing traditional material on the site. Like, you're going to have to study this, right? Like, and you need someone that is licensed to do this, because when we have individuals in the home, we always think about health, safety, and welfare. So they ended up stopping about it. And I said, well, send me what you have, and, we can talk about this again. As a professional, it's like, yeah, we're licensed to do these things. And I love that story that Ted brought up. And it was like, I get this email out of nowhere about, here's this, and it's a very nice hogan that they were doing. But of course they need some help, in terms of putting the structure together.
And it's kind of interesting that, when I've referenced some of the historic narratives of historic architecture, like places like Arikara or Mandan or so on and so forth, the thing that always constantly surprises me is that there were indigenous technicians there that were knowledgeable about how to put these things together the correct way. And in the case of those earth houses there was a whole women's society that was trained to essentially be the architects of the community. And it was their responsibility to direct the men to put together the heavy work for this, but it was their care and their technical expertise that made sure that these things were sustainable.
Thank you so much for these comments. I love where this is going. We are at time, but I'm curious if you three could stick around for one more question. Do you have time for that?
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, so this is more of a professional question from Summer Sutton. When hiring and expanding your architecture/planning firms, what skills and knowledges do you want your future employees to have when it comes to working with and for Indigenous communities and on Indigenous land?
Good.
So hi, Summer. It's good to hear from you. It's been a long time, so I'll just say that. But I think, part of that responsibility goes to our profession in architecture schools. We just really need to make room in order to bring these kinds of discussions and techniques into the mainstream, because I think we can all benefit, both as Indigenous practitioners, but also in terms of other people learning from the kind of Indigenous knowledge that we've grown.
Yeah, for me, I don't have a particular checklist of, how I want to grow my business. But, I like to collaborate with others if I don't have them specifically in the office. Maybe a botanist person, that we're working with in terms of landscaping, working with someone that may also have history within a tribal indigenous community that we may not know. They may be an elder, they may be a community member, they may be a youth component to it. But I think, in terms of this indigenous worldview, I don't think there's just one person. I think it's that connection to, everything, every spirit that we're around. Even in terms of technology, in terms of like communication. So it's not just one person. And I think, having an architectural, again, education is definitely a plus.
Yeah, and I would add, I would say that, and I'm biased, right? So trained as an architect, planner, I've kind of gone through that process, and I would say that individuals that go and study architecture typically go to study architecture, planning, design, engineering, because they have a passion in the field, right? They want to bring that passion to the field, and they see the potential to impact some sense of change. And so that type of energy is something that I think we're consistently looking for, and for those individuals to always be on their learning curve, right? Always wanting to be learning something new and applying that knowledge to the field. And I find that to be incredibly exciting when we're interviewing individuals, when those individuals are working on particular projects like that gives me the energy to kind of continue moving forward in this space. So the excitement that one brings to the field.
Well, with that, I think that's our first panel for the day. So Tinigwech, thank you so much for joining us here. I really hope we can actually welcome you to this building someday. But we're really just so grateful for you sharing your thoughts and your knowledge and your experience with this design community. And I think that the Harvard GSD community and all of those who were able to join us from all over the continent and beyond actually really received a lot from this conversation today. So thank you so much. All right.
Thank you. We'll see you.
Thanks, everyone.